Hey guys, welcome back, and today we're looking at one of my favorite Nintendo 64 games of all time, and that's Perfect Dark. It was the sequel to GoldenEye and originally released in 2000. 10 years later, it was given a remaster for the Xbox 360, and it saw a lot of improvements, but also some things that weren't quite as good as the original. So here's my review, I hope you enjoy. The top 3 games I was most excited for coming out was Turok 2, Halo 2, and Perfect Dark. I was obsessed with Perfect Dark. Knowing this was basically a sequel to GoldenEye, I knew that greatness was coming. I would scour the magazine racks every week for any news or screenshots of its development. I remember when it came close to release, I saw a magazine showing screenshots of the first couple of levels. I must have read those pages like 500 times. Oh yes. It was amazing. When the game finally came out, me and my friend Michael played this game every day for an entire summer. The day we beat the villa on Perfect Dark was a day to remember. Attempt after attempt, planning how we were going to take out those snipers. It was just so much fun. And then the regular multiplayer mode. Hours and hours of just holding up in a room with magnums drawn waiting for simulants to open the door. So many good times. I say all of this so you know that I am pretty biased with this game. It can do no wrong. For the story, you play as Joanna Dark, who is an agent for the Research and Development Institute called the Carrington Institute. You're trying to get information and stop a corporation named Datadyne, who are trying to take over the world with the help of some bad aliens called the Skidar, who also seek to destroy the Earth. The journey has you stopping at many places, such as the Datadyne corporate building, to Area 51, to even Air Force One to protect the president. I never really cared too much for the story when I got it originally, but it's kind of neat sci-fi story for a Nintendo 64 game. The graphics in general were quite an upgrade over GoldenEye. The character models were better, the levels were larger and more varied, the lighting was also significantly better. They finally added reload animations to the guns, and this was a huge deal to me back then. Seeing Joanna put in a clip and cycle the chamber on a gun was just so cool. Death animations of the enemies were expanded upon as well. Just like Turok 2, enemies react to being shot in different places. Yes, Perfect Dark enemies don't react realistically, but they give you this action movie feel. It's good. The developers also brought blood to the game, which was a big deal to me back then. Now, it's not quite as violent as Turok 2, but it is significantly more violent than something like GoldenEye. Now, with all this came a price, and that price was performance. Right off the bat, you're going to need an expansion pack for this game to play story mode. Even with the pack, though, frame rate was abysmal. We're talking 10 to 15 frames. The option menu also offers a high res mode, but that is just a death wish. Sure, it looks better, but it was like watching a slideshow at that point. According to a recent video by Digital Foundry, the performance drops by an average of 3 frames in single player mode when using the expansion pack. That doesn't seem like much, but when the frame rate's already that low, it makes a difference. Multiplayer runs in the low teens to single digits when you're getting to 3 or 4 player action. It's really tough to go back to that. And it's weird, when I was a kid, I always played in high res mode. I was so focused on good graphics, I would just suffer through this terrible frame rate. Now, to understand what it was like playing back then, I need to show you the different output modes. Most people remember using composite or RCA cables for the system. It looks okay, but not great. Actually, I take that back. It looks fine on a CRT TV. It does not look good when you're using a modern LCD display. RCA was probably the most used by people all the way up to the PS2. Here's a capture of the Nintendo 64 running RCA. Now, if you were a fancy type, you used an S-video cable. My footage here doesn't look that much different from RCA, but trust me, it's worth the upgrade. Without modifying the console, this is the best output you can get from the system. Then there's the way that I played. Before I became all pretentious like everybody else talking about frames per second, resolution, chroma subsampling, pixel response time, blah blah blah, I used good old RF. And this is how I played all of my systems until the PS2 when I moved to S-Video. I still remember we had this really old CRT that had this hissing sound when you turned it on, and if you looked very closely in the vents in the back, you could see this blue arc. I'm sure it was probably the safest thing we had in the house. Anyways, looking at the RF output now, it seems like a retro filter that some games offer. It looks kinda cool, you know, in a terrible way. Now these captures aren't 100% accurate to what it was like. In order to get RF footage, I had to do this. RF to a VCR. Now I don't have a remote for the VCR in order to get it to channel 3, so I have to insert a VHS tape. Luckily, I have this one. Then from the VCR, I'm doing a composite out to a processor that does a digital conversion and sends it via HDMI to my capture card. So it's not quite accurate, but it still gives you an idea of what it was like. I'm actually using my original Nintendo 64 purchased in February of 1997. This baby has seen some upgrades though. I replaced all the capacitors on the system and the power supply, and I also had the system HDMI modded, so it now outputs a pure digital signal at 240p, which can then be scaled internally up to 1080p from the board installed in the system. Now there's also an RGB modification available for the Nintendo 64 that allows you to use a SCART connector or specific component cables like the ones provided by HD Retrovision. I don't have the modification available to show you, but from the videos I've seen, it looks closer if not identical to the HDMI board. Now we have to move on to the remaster, and the remaster's graphics are really good. This was originally made for the Xbox 360 as a smaller budget game, so I wouldn't compare it to something like the Halo remasters, but it is still impressive. The developers didn't use the original code, but instead went with a new engine to avoid emulation. So everything that you see here except for the level layouts are new. The remaster outputted at a full 1080p on the 360. The game recently got a 4K patch for the Xbox One X, so that is how I'm playing here. Since my capture card is 1080p max, what you're seeing is 4K downscaled to 1080p. It is astounding how many modes are available in Perfect Dark. First you have the main campaign, and the campaign is pretty lengthy and will give you quite a challenge in the higher difficulties. There are 21 levels in total, each with 3 difficulties, and increasing the difficulty makes you take on more damage and have additional objectives for each mission. This is almost identical to GoldenEye, so if you've played that, then you'll be right at home here. In some cases, additional objectives open up more sections or interactions with the level, so there's kind of an incentive to try to beat that levels in the higher difficulties. The game does suffer, however, from objectives being very vague in some cases. This was kind of a common problem though in first-person shooters of that era. To me, figuring out what to do is kind of part of the fun, but I could see people getting frustrated with the game. Some missions' starting point and layout change based on difficulty. For instance, on the Villa level, you start on a perch where you have to snipe 2 Datadyne guards before they kill a negotiator. On the hardest difficulty, you start as the negotiator, and you have to disarm the guards. I really like these little changes, and I wish they would have done more of this in the missions. But for the most part, the levels are pretty unique and they never really got stale for me. The game's difficulty is similar to some of the other first-person shooters I've reviewed for the Nintendo 64. On the N64, I was never able to complete the game on the hardest difficulty. I just couldn't get past the Carrington Institute level towards the end. Now on the remaster, I was able to complete the whole game in just a few days. Having played both now, I think some of the game's difficulty comes from the performance. It's just so much easier to dodge fire and get around enemies on the remaster. Now I have to talk about the weapons. The weapons were upgraded from GoldenEye with the inclusion of a secondary fire. For example, if you're unarmed, your primary is just a regular punch attack. But if you select the secondary attack, you're able to disarm and daze your enemy. This is a lot of fun in multiplayer. Other weapons like the laptop gun fire like a standard machine gun in primary mode, and then can be mounted anywhere as a gun turret in secondary mode. Playing this for the first time, it was just so exciting to see a new weapon and try out its capabilities. Although completely overpowered, the far sight is the coolest weapon in the game. You're able to see and shoot through walls with this thing. The secondary fire allows you to auto-track targets, and this is what makes the gun overpowered. If you make a rule of no secondary fire in multiplayer, you can have a lot of fun with it. Yeah, remember the days of making rules with friends in local multiplayer? No odd job. Absolutely no odd job. There is one gun that I would consider the workhorse gun, and it's in almost every single level, and is the key to beating the game on the Perfect Dark difficulty, and that gun is the CMP 150 machine gun. This is the standard weapon held by enemies, and the secondary fire is just overpowered. It allows you to highlight an enemy by putting your aiming crosshair on them. Then the gun will automatically start tracking them. Just highlight a bunch of enemies and pull the trigger. The gun does the rest. This is very important on the later levels on perfect difficulty, where I found I was doing a lot of popping in and out of a doorway and shooting. How you use the weapons is a little bit different in the game when compared to something like Turok. Since the game is broken up into individual missions, you'll need to use all the weapons given to you. Conserving ammo is never really an issue with this game. The campaign can also be played cooperatively. With exception to Hex N64, I believe this was the first first-person shooter on the N64 to have a co-op mode. Playing through the game with a buddy is honestly just a blast. Some levels, like the villa like I mentioned earlier, has one player providing sniper cover while the other one is down at the docks. Both players take separate paths in the beginning and they get to meet up. Other levels you get to knock out different objectives at the same time. On the Nintendo 64, it was tough to deal with frame rate when doing split screen, but everything is just as smooth as butter on the remaster. And with the remaster, you can also play co-op over Xbox Live, although I had some problems doing that, which I'll mention later. There's also a counter-operative mode, which has one player completing the story, while the other player spawns as one of the regular enemies and attempts to stop you. If the player playing as one of the enemies dies, they'll respawn into another enemy, and that player can also take a suicide pill if they're too far from the action. They're basically one of the agents from the Matrix. This is the first and might be the last time I saw this feature in a first-person shooter. I never really played this mode that much, but it's still really neat to have, and I could see this mode getting a lot of play online. Kinda like invading someone's game in the Dead Souls series. Pretending to be a regular NPC in the level would be pretty fun. There is also the regular multiplayer aspect, and it's even more robust than GoldenEye. You have a large list of game types to choose from, and almost everything is completely customizable. I mean everything. This time they added bots, or as they call them, simulants, so you can play multiplayer aspects solo if you want to. The simulants can also be given certain attributes or personalities. For instance, there's a revenge sim that will go after the person that last killed it, or the coward sim that will run away from a fight the first chance it gets. The addition to bots to multiplayer at this time was just a game changer. I cannot tell you how many hours that me and my friend Michael would camp in different rooms trying to defeat bots set to dark difficulty. Within multiplayer, there is also a challenge mode that has 39 different challenges. Each one gets more difficult and varies in scenarios. Also, each one has to be cleared with 1 player, 2 players, 3, and 4. One challenge will have you playing a match of King of the Hill versus a group of simulants, while another is just a standard game of Capture the Flag. Again, the challenges are pretty varied and it gets really difficult at the end. I swear the last challenge is pure luck if you can beat it. The multiplayer was probably what I played the most as a kid, but nowadays I just have a hard time talking people into playing a split-screen first-person shooter from 2000. So which version of the game should you play today? Well, if you're playing single player with the graphics set to low resolution, then I would say the 64 version is still somewhat playable. Anything else though, the remaster is a must at this point. The Nintendo 64 version was great for its time, but the performance problems are just too hard to overlook now when you have something like the remaster locked to 60 frames per second. Now that's not to say there are not any problems with the remaster. There are a couple control issues that I just can't overlook. First is the feeling of the aiming when you turn on the targeting reticle. There seems to be like a dead zone with the analog sticks that's not present on the Nintendo 64 version. The aiming just doesn't feel as accurate or fluid with the Xbox One controller. I almost never use the targeting reticle on the Xbox version. It may not be technically broken, but it does feel different from the N64 version and not in a good way. The controls are definitely broken when playing Xbox Live with a friend. The target reticle just does not move correctly with the analog stick in co-op. It kind of jumps all over the place. Also, there seems to be some significant input lag in playing co-op online. Besides aiming, moving just has a really big delay. It feels like over 100 milliseconds. I thought it was our connection at first, but then there were no issues when we switched to another game. I'm playing this on the Xbox One X, so maybe there's an issue with the emulation or backwards compatibility. I'm not sure. Perhaps it doesn't happen on the Xbox 360, but it definitely made online co-op extremely difficult on the One. Finally, I have a smaller control issue. Perfect Dark offers legacy controls, which basically mimics the controls of the Nintendo 64. Left stick moves and turns, right stick strafes and looks up and down. This is my preferred control type when available. My first shooters were on the Nintendo 64, so that's what I'm used to. The problem I have with the legacy controls in this game is when you use the sniper rifle. With the standard controls, the targeting reticle is moved with the right analog stick, and in the case of the sniper rifle, the left stick zooms in and out. On the legacy controls, they forgot to change the mapping for the zooming in and out, so when you push on the left stick to move the reticle, it zooms at the same time, making it impossible to aim. And this is not the biggest deal because in the campaign you only use the sniper rifle once. Multiplayer, it could be an issue though. but this affects like 1% of players. But hey, we matter. Overall, Perfect Dark is a classic that should be played. The game has its faults, but every game does. You can sometimes find the rare replay compilation under $10 physical, so there's no reason not to get this game. Let me know in the comments what you think of the game. Do you have the same rose-tinted glasses as I have? Okay, that was my review for Perfect Dark. What'd you guys think? Do you think it's a good game that still holds up, or am I just being crazy and just love it because of nostalgia? Let me know. I think if you're going to choose between which version to play, definitely do the 360. I think the frame rate problems on the original Nintendo 64 version are just too hard to go back to now, unless you grew up playing with it. You can play the 64 version on PC, emulate it, and then you don't have to deal so much with the frame rate. Plus, you get keyboard and mouse support with a mod. So that's another avenue to go towards playing it. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments, and thanks for watching.